The casserole was still warm, the cranberry pie untouched, and the third place at the table remained empty. Helen Brooks adjusted the fork beside her napkin not because it was crooked, but because her hands needed something to do. The candle at the center of the table remained unlit. She had meant to light it. Somehow, she couldn't bring herself to. The house smelled of rosemary chicken and slow-cooked cider. She had cleaned everything down to the old photo of their family trip to Colorado, still framed on the shelf near the fireplace. It had been years, but she still slept on the left side of the bed. Not because she missed her late husband more from that side, but because it kept her from rolling too far into the empty space beside her. At exactly 6:58 p.m., the front door opened without a knock. No greeting. No warmth. Just the scuff of boots on the welcome mat she had crushed herself. Jason entered first. He wore a windbreaker, no scarf, holding a phone in one hand and scrolling with the other. Behind him was Vanessa, 6 months pregnant, wearing a designer coat and a handbag that cost more than Helen's car. Her eyes roamed the room like she was scouting a property. "Still got those popcorn ceilings, huh?" she muttered. Helen stood. "Dinner's ready," she said, soft but clear. Jason nodded without looking up. "Smells good," he added absently. Vanessa laughed lightly. "You made all this? That's adorable." They sat. The silence was heavy, broken only by the soft clink of cutlery. After a few bites, Jason cleared his throat. "So Vanessa and I were thinking we'd stay here for a bit. Just a few months. Until after the baby." Helen didn't respond. "You've got this big house, and it just makes sense," Jason continued. "Maybe you'd be more comfortable somewhere quieter. Like, a retirement home." Or, Vanessa added with a smirk, "You could just stay and help around here. Cook, clean grandma stuff." Helen looked down at her cranberry pie. Her hands had trembled while making it. She had held the mixing spoon like a lifeline. She looked up slowly. "You've both made yourselves at home," she said. "Just don't expect me to serve." The next morning, the kitchen looked like a page out of a modern catalog. A brand new chrome toaster gleamed on the counter. Its cord stretched across the tile like it owned the space. Helen noticed it the second she stepped into the room. The ceramic jar where she kept her handwritten recipes was gone. She opened the drawer beneath the microwave. Her tea tins were missing every one of them. In their place sat a row of sleek metal containers still sealed. No handwritten labels. No scent of chamomile or mint. Just uniform, soulless design. She opened the pantry next. The jars she had collected for decades preserves, dried herbs, spices from old road trips were pushed to the back. Boxes of prenatal vitamins and plastic snack containers now occupied the front shelves. On the floor lay a torn cloth bag of dried beans she had brought home from Maine. Helen bent down to pick it up, but paused when she heard Vanessa's voice. "It smells old in here," Vanessa called from the hallway. "Not vintage old, just dusty." Helen didn't answer. Vanessa walked into the kitchen, her phone in one hand, her other hand resting on her belly. "Do you use mothballs?" she asked, nose wrinkled. "It's cedar," Helen whispered. Vanessa shrugged. "Not exactly baby-safe, just saying." She reached into the cabinet above the stove and pulled out a chipped mug, the one Helen's husband used every morning for nearly 30 years. The handle had a small crack, but he always said it gave the cup character. Vanessa barely looked at it before tossing it into a cardboard box labeled "Donate or Toss." "I'll take care of those," Helen said quickly. Vanessa blinked like she hadn't heard her. "Sure, whatever works." From down the hall, Jason's voice chimed in. "Can we keep it down? I've got back-to-back calls this morning." He didn't wait for a reply. Helen stood in the middle of her own kitchen, feeling like a guest in a showroom. The smell of rosemary had vanished, replaced by the scent of plastic wrap and shipping tape. She turned back toward the trash bin and found it half full with things that once held memories. And no one had even noticed. That afternoon, while Vanessa napped and Jason muttered behind a closed office door, Helen slipped on her wool coat and stepped out into the chill. The air bit at her cheeks, but she welcomed it. It reminded her she was still alive. Still hers. She walked 3 blocks, past the oak trees shedding their last golden leaves, until she reached the corner diner, Maggie's Place. The bell above the door jingled, and the warm smell of coffee and cinnamon toast greeted her like an old friend. Behind the counter, a familiar face lit up. "Helen Brooks, well I'll be." Maggie Lynn stepped out from behind the register, wiping her hands on her apron. "Hot cider, right?" Helen nodded. Still remember? Always. You and Tom came here every November. Helen took her usual seat at the corner window booth. Outside, a boy chased a dog through a pile of leaves. Inside, a young couple laughed over pancakes, their hands occasionally brushing between bites. After a few minutes, Maggie brought the cider. Everything okay at home? Helen wrapped her fingers around the mug. Getting there. She said it like a promise, but to whom she wasn't sure. On the table next to the napkin holder lay a local newspaper, folded open to a half-page and bordered in tiny snowflake graphics. It caught her eye. Skyview Retirement Community Winter Art Residency. Rediscover what you left behind. Helen stared at the words for a long time. The steam from her cider thinned. Her breath slowed. Skyview. She'd heard of it quiet, private, with personal suites and a greenhouse. Maggie had once mentioned it had a waiting list a mile long. But the ad said something different now. Something like a door left ajar. She traced the edge of the paper with her finger. For years she'd convinced herself that staying meant strength. But what if leaving on her terms wasn't surrender? What if it was something else? When she returned home, the kitchen smelled like microwave popcorn. Jason was on a Zoom call. Vanessa was watching TV with a bowl of cereal balanced on her belly. Helen didn't speak to either of them. She walked past the noise and into her bedroom. She opened her nightstand drawer and pulled out a small notebook. And for the first time in years, she started to plan for herself. The next morning, Helen waited until the house was quiet. Jason had left for errands. Vanessa was upstairs scrolling her phone in bed. She sat at her desk in the corner of the guest room, her room now, really, and picked up the phone with steady hands. Skyview Estate, good afternoon. The woman's voice was calm, warm, like honey stirred into tea. Helen cleared her throat. I'd like to ask about availability. For independent living. A private suite if possible. We do have a south-facing corner unit available, second floor, fireplace, private garden access. Move-in can be scheduled within 10 days. Helen looked out the window at the brittle garden. Can you send me a brochure? And a quote for full payment? Certainly, ma'am. You'd qualify for our long-term rate. Helen gave her email, one she hadn't used in years. The receptionist promised to send everything within the hour. Before hanging up, Helen asked quietly, is it possible to move in before Thanksgiving? Yes, the voice replied. We can have the suite ready by the 22nd. Helen closed her eyes. I'd like that. She hung up and let her hands rest in her lap for a long moment. Then she opened the drawer beneath the desk and pulled out an old ledger, the one her husband Tom had used to manage their finances. Every page still held his handwriting, neat columns, tidy math, notes scribbled in margins. She turned to the last page. He had left enough, more than enough. Beneath the ledger sat a yellow stenopad. Helen tore off a sheet and wrote a name she hadn't spoken aloud in years. Mr. Hendricks. Their family attorney for decades. She walked to the hallway where the rotary phone still hung. The dial clicked with each number. After 2 rings, the assistant picked up. Helen left a message. Tell Mr. Hendricks Helen Brooks would like to schedule an appointment. Tomorrow, if possible. As she placed the receiver back on the hook, she felt something inside her click into place, like a puzzle piece that had waited too long to be acknowledged. Not revenge, not rebellion. Just reclamation. She looked around the house, the curtains she had sewn, the photos she had framed, the walls she had painted with Tom. And she whispered to herself, it's time. The morning of her departure came with no ceremony, no suitcase by the door, no drawn blinds. Just quiet and purpose. Helen moved through the house slowly, placing items in a single travel bag. Her wool robe, a few books, the sketchpad Maggie had given her. Nothing that would be missed by anyone else. Everything that still belonged to her. Downstairs, Vanessa stood in the kitchen, scrolling her phone with one hand and holding a half-eaten granola bar in the other. We're out of prenatal vitamins, she said without looking up. Can you pick some up next time you're at the store? Helen didn't answer. She opened the side drawer, pulled out a single white envelope, and slid it gently into her purse. She turned to Vanessa and said softly, you'll have to manage without me. Vanessa blinked, confused. Wait, what do you mean? But Helen had already stepped out of the kitchen. Upstairs, Jason's voice echoed from behind the office door. I told you, the house is worth more than that. If she'd just signed the damn thing over. Helen stopped at the bottom of the stairs, looking up. He didn't know. Not yet. Back in her bedroom, she placed the white envelope on the desk facing forward, easy to see. On the front, she wrote in her clean, steady handwriting, "To be opened after my departure." Inside was no anger, no explanation, just a list. A copy of the deed transfer. A confirmation of the art grant she had funded. Termination notices for all shared financial accounts. And one simple note. This was always my home, not because of the deed, but because I made it so. She closed the envelope with calm hands. Later that evening, after she had already left, Jason would find it. He would search for her, try to call, demand an explanation. But by then, Helen would be sipping tea at Skyview. The fireplace lit, the corner suite quiet. Her name no longer spoken as obligation, but as her own. Her seat at the old dining table would remain empty that night. And for once, she wouldn't feel guilty about it. The house was quiet by late evening, the kind of quiet that felt hollow, like a place holding its breath. Helen stood in the dining room, her hands resting on the back of the chair where she used to sit. On the table was the same candle she had never lit the night Jason and Vanessa arrived. She picked up the matchbox from the drawer, struck a flame, and watched the wick take. The soft glow flickered for a moment, then held steady. This time, it wasn't for dinner. She didn't set the table. No napkins folded into triangles, no crystal glasses, just the candle and its small, unwavering light. The warmth from the flame touched her face. It reminded her of quiet nights before everything shifted. Back when meals meant conversation, not negotiation. When love wasn't measured in convenience or guilt. Somewhere down the hall, Vanessa laughed at something on TV. A bag of chips crinkled open. Jason's voice rose in complaint from the study, too muffled to matter. Helen sat in silence beside the candle. The soft hum of the refrigerator, the tick of the clock on the wall, these were the only sounds that kept her company now. She didn't feel bitter, only still. Her eyes moved slowly across the room over the photographs that hadn't been taken down, the worn edge of the rug Tom had chosen, the corner where the Christmas tree always stood. It no longer looked like home. Not because it had changed, but because she had. She reached into her purse and pulled out a sticky note. On it, she had written a single word in ink that didn't shake. Departure. Below it, the date and time of her move. November 22nd, 10 a.m. She pressed it gently onto the vanity mirror upstairs. It hovered beside her reflection like a promise already kept. The suitcase rested near the door. It didn't creak when she zipped it closed. It only whispered back. It's time. Helen sat on the edge of her bed one last time, hands folded in her lap. The suitcase beside her, worn and familiar, had traveled through every major chapter of her life. And now it would carry her into one more. Not away from something, but toward herself. The sun spilled gently through the garden room's windows, painting the hardwood floor in quiet gold. Outside, the last leaves clung to the trees, defiant and trembling. Inside Skyview, everything moved with intention. No one rushed. No one explained themselves. Helen sat in a soft armchair, her fingers curled around a ceramic mug filled with cinnamon tea. Across the room, someone played a melody on the piano, slow, careful, a little unsure, but beautiful in its own way. From down the hallway came the faint sound of a choir rehearsal. Laughter floated gently like steam from a warm cup. There were no expectations here, no raised voices, just space. Maggie Lynn appeared at her side, wrapped in a handmade shawl that looked like something out of a coastal knitting magazine. "Told you it'd feel like breathing again," she said, smiling. "You were right," Helen whispered. Maggie pointed with her chin toward a long table in the corner, where a few residents sat painting small canvases. They were laughing about pie crust recipes and watercolor brushes. "After brunch, I expect you there. They're painting orchids today." "Is it required?" Helen teased. "No, but I'll guilt you into it anyway." The Thanksgiving brunch at Skyview was simple. Slices of roast turkey, cranberry compote in delicate porcelain bowls, cornbread muffins warm enough to melt the butter. No one went around the table saying what they were thankful for. They didn't need to. It was in the way people passed the sugar. In the way they asked about each other's grandkids and garden boxes. In the quiet comfort of being seen without having to earn it. Later that afternoon, Helen walked to the greenhouse corridor. The orchids there bloomed in defiant, delicate colors: white, violet, pale yellow. She reached into her tote, the one Maggie had left for her on the first night, and pulled out the sketch pad. She hadn't drawn anything in years. Her hand trembled slightly at first, but slowly the lines took shape. The orchid she sketched wasn't perfect. A little crooked, a little unsure, but it was hers. And in that moment, she realized she wasn't a visitor here. She was home. Back at the house Helen had left behind, the kitchen lights were off. Dirty dishes sat stacked in the sink, untouched mail piled beside a knocked-over vase. The warmth had gone out of the place, and not just because of the temperature. Jason stood in the living room, a manila folder trembling in his hands. "What do you mean it's not in my name?" he snapped. Across from him, Mr. Hendricks adjusted the collar of his coat and replied evenly, "The property has been transferred. You're no longer listed." "That's impossible." Jason flipped to the final page, his eyes scanning the words. Then he stopped. Her signature was there, clear, decisive. Behind him, Vanessa crossed her arms, her voice sharp. "I'm not raising a baby in someone else's leftover life." "You think I planned this?" Jason fired back. "She's punishing me." "No," Mr. Hendricks said, his voice calm. "She simply stopped being your backup plan." Jason slumped onto the couch, his hands covering his face, the folder slipping to the floor. That evening, back at Skyview, the hallway glowed softly under wall sconces shaped like open books. Helen sat by the window with a second cup of tea. Outside, snow had begun to fall light, unhurried. Maggie walked by, tapping the bulletin board with a pen. "Next week we're making hand-tied wreaths," she said without stopping. "You better sign up." "Do I get extra points if I make 2? Helen called after her. Maggie smirked and disappeared into her suite. When Helen returned to her room, something pale lay just inside the door, a folded sheet of paper. No envelope. No name. Just her suite number written in uneven blue ink. She recognized the handwriting before she unfolded it. "Mom, I don't know if you'll read this or keep it. I'm not asking for anything. I just needed to write it." He wrote of warehouse shifts and aching hands, of cold mornings and cheap coffee, of going to meetings, trying. He wrote, "I used to think love was a currency, that if you stopped paying it meant you stopped caring. Now I know. You didn't stop loving me, you just stopped letting me spend it recklessly." There was no signature, just one final line. "I understand now." Helen folded the letter and placed it in the drawer beside her husband's notes. She didn't read it again. She didn't need to.